9:35 with great pleasure. We welcome to the program from the NBC Today Show, Al Roker. Good morning, Al.
Hey, Rollin, how you doing?
Doing wonderful. Busy morning as we're out here talking about your book here, right around storm time in the United States. It's the storm of the century, and we're not talking Katrina, but we're talking a storm that actually happened more than a century prior to Katrina.
Yeah, it was the Great Gulf Hurricane of 1900. This is before they named storms. They didn't start doing that until 1958. But I was going to write a book about Katrina in the 10th anniversary. And this is about a year ago, a little more than a year ago. And when I was reading about great hurricanes that affected this country, I kept looking at this Gulf Hurricane of 1900 and realized, this thing to this day. Katrina, 1,800 people, upwards of 1,800 people, a little bit more than that, lost their lives. Over 10,000 people lost their lives in this Gulf hurricane. Still the greatest number of deaths for a natural disaster in the U.S.
And that's something that seems like maybe it's been lost in history because really a lot of folks just aren't aware of this great catastrophe that happened in 1900.
Yeah, it's one of these things. We're still at the dawn of. There was very little. Actually, in the Library of Congress, we found about 40 seconds of newsreel footage. Thomas Alva Edison's assistant happened to be in Galveston when this happened. But there's a lot of photographs. But it's one of those things. Turn of the century. It was, in fact, the first natural disaster covered by our national press, and given the amount of attention it got, it became kind of a cause celeb, if you will. People started donating relief funds and relief efforts and supplies. It was the first time, really, that happened on a national basis.
The storm wiped out Galveston, like Katrina wiped out New Orleans. But were there other coastal cities that also suffered?
Yeah, near Houston took a battering. There were towns that were near there that took a battering, but Galveston was, like the crown jewel of the Gulf Coast. It was a glittering city. We're talking. It had an opera house. It had banks. There were more. A city of 37,000. There were more millionaires per capita in Galveston than any place in America. So it was a well-off city, and it was a diverse city. Blacks, whites, Hispanics, Jews. Blacks, of course, being segregated. But it was a very diverse society, and unfortunately, because of the prevailing thoughts at the time that big storms couldn't hit the Gulf Coast because they had a natural curve, combine that with the fact that the U.S. Weather Bureau at the time was in charge of issuing forecasts for local markets, not the local forecast offices, and the fact that the people who were the best suited to do this and had the best expertise, and in fact it issued a forecast that predicted this, was the Jesuit Scientific Meteorological Institute in Cuba. But unfortunately at the time, U.S. Weather Bureau run by a bureaucrat by the name of Willis Moore, said, we don't take information from you, we give information. And thereby ordered the lines cut, the telegraph lines cut between Cuba and the U.S., mainland U.S., so that forecast never got out. And so it wasn't until about 6 hours before the storm hit that the forecasters realized that something was drastically wrong.
Al Roker here, The Storm of the Century. When you wrote the book, you've really made it a great story where you've involved the actual storylines of people's lives, including, would it be your counterpart, the resident weatherman, Isaac Klein?
Yeah, Isaac Klein. There was an amazing book written by Eric Larson called Isaac's Storm. And he was the preeminent hurricane forecaster in America, and was based in Galveston. But again, that prevailing thought about what hurricanes would do. In fact, he testified to the city council. No, you don't need to build a seawall. Don't spend that money because big storms don't hit. They had smaller storms hit, and there was flooding, but they always thought that they were kind of immune from it.
The book, The Storm of the Century, it does get into some details of the prior, then the aftermath, and just how gruesome it was. Like we talked about, Katrina left us with nearly 2,000 dead, but you said over 10,000 dead out of this.
And they were literally all throughout the streets, and there was no way to get rid of the bodies. And so they had dead gangs. At first, they conscripted able-bodied black men to load the bodies onto barges and then ship them out into the ocean and dump the bodies about 15 miles offshore. Problem was, tide brought them back in.
Oh,
and so they realized if there was one sideline to this, or benefit, if you will, they actually, for the first time, had integrated work crews in Galveston, and their job was basically to burn bodies 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's the only way they could get rid of them.
I've been to Galveston, and I found it a great little Texas coastal town. But is it anywhere near? Did it ever rebuild anywhere near to what the glory was prior to this storm?
Not quite. Things changed. They did a great job of building the seawall, and also literally, physically raising the downtown about 1.5 feet. But other towns sprung up. Other coastal towns kind of took up the slack and became bustling port cities, so that Galveston never quite regained that same luster that it had.
Al Roker, the premier weatherman of our country, right? So I've got to ask you the question out here in California. We've been in drought conditions for some time now. Will this winter change things around for us? Are we going to get some rain?
Well, look, the deal is there is a strong El Nino, perhaps the strongest on record, developing. We think. That's the problem with El Nino. You can have all the indicators, but it may not come to fruition. And if it did develop, that means maybe more storms coming across Northern California. The problem is it's probably going to be warmer, so that means less snow, which means less snowpack. And the other problem facing California now, unfortunately, because of up until recently, unregulated groundwater pumping, aquifers have collapsed. And so once those impact on each other and compact on each other and collapse, they can't be recharged, or can't be recharged to the capacity that they once had or could hold. So it's a really dismal situation, and we don't know whether or not this El Nino is going to help or not.
Well, Al, you're nothing but good news.
What can I say?
I appreciate it very much.
You sound like my daughter.
Yeah. Al Roker, The Storm of the Century. It's a great read, the Great Gulf Hurricane of 1900. Pleasure to have you on the program. Look forward to seeing you on TV, and thanks again for writing the book and sharing it with us this morning.
Oh, thank you, sir.
All right. Bye-bye.